everyone on this afternoon. Especially welcome to our special guest, Congressman LaHood, who is in Peoria at the moment. And just a little bit about Congressman LaHood. He was born and raised in Peoria. He serves the constituents of the 18th District of Illinois. The Congressman's record throughout his public service has resonated as a strong conservative record, promoting economic development and fiscal responsibility. The Congressman currently serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, co-chairs the U.S.-China Working Group, the U.S.-Brazil Caucus, the Digital Trade Caucus, and one of our favorites, the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus. Now, just to set the stage a little bit for all of us as we begin this discussion, after the indigenous Christian communities in Iraq and Syria were almost eradicated by ISIS's genocides against them, Lebanon became the last bastion of flourishing Christianity in the Middle East. Hezbollah is now engaged in a similar campaign in Lebanon aimed at driving the Christian population completely out of the country. In Iraq and Syria, ISIS used barbaric strategies to destroy Christian communities. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is leveraging the financial crisis, the Iranian regional adventurism, and the Syrian civil war to make the situation unbearable for Christians at the moment. Hezbollah constantly chooses the interests of Iran over the people of Lebanon, endangering the existence of the Christian community. And they have done all of this deliberately. So today, as we welcome Congressman LaHood, we're going to talk about some COVID-19 updates, the financial crisis in Lebanon, Iran's influence in the region, and most important, the U.S. partnership with the LAF, or the Lebanese Armed Forces. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Peter as he's going to moderate. We'll ask the Congressman some questions and take some Q&A. Peter?
Thank you, Tonya. Thank you, Congress. Thank you to everyone who's joining. In just a few minutes, we will go over to questions and answers from you all. There's a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen if you're on join the webinar with us, and so please use that option to enter your questions, and in a moment we'll get to those. Congressman, I just want to start with what's on the front of everyone's mind, which is the coronavirus, how it's affecting our communities, especially in your district. So maybe first of all, what are some of the things you're doing as a member of Congress to respond? And what are some of the ways you've seen your district rise to the challenge of this really straining time?
Well, first of all, let me just thank the IDC and its membership, and also you, Peter, and Tonya, for helping to put this together, and for all the viewers out there that we have on Zoom. I wish I could be with you all in person, as I know we all do, but we can't do that today. So it's an honor for me to be with you today, to take your questions and talk through a few things that are vitally important to me, obviously to Christians, to the country of Lebanon, and also many other issues. So happy to be with you today. Let me just, in terms of the federal response, obviously this is something over the last 8 weeks, Peter, that is not something we asked for or we sought, but we've had to deal with. And it is a dual crisis. It is a health crisis and an economic crisis. And the district that I'm fortunate to represent in west central Illinois, I have about 19 counties that I represent, 710,000 people. And we've been dealing with it like a lot of the other parts of the country. I will say this, my district has not been affected with the cases, the infection rates that say Chicago or other hotspots around the country. So we've been blessed that we have not been affected the way others have been. However, obviously, we have responded accordingly in terms of following the CDC guidelines, Illinois Department of Public Health, exercising social distancing, and that is, helped to keep down on the cases and the infection rates. But this is something that has had a drastic effect on our country, as we've seen. We're getting up close to 85,000 deaths in the United States, which is really unprecedented, and I don't think anybody expected to happen. And on the federal level, I've been in DC twice in the last month. I'm heading there again this Thursday. And we have passed 4 pieces of legislation in response to the COVID pandemic. We have spent $3 trillion. That's the most money ever spent in this short period of time by the federal government. That doesn't include the 4 to 5 trillion that the Fed has pumped into the economy by way of liquidity. So I think the response has been good, and that has really focused that $3 trillion in a number of areas. PPP, which is our small business program, the Paycheck Protection Program, $700 billion. It's really been a lifeline to our small businesses to keep people on the payroll. We've given a lot of money to hospitals and healthcare workers, a lot of money for PPE. We've given direct checks to individuals. We've allocated about $400 billion for distressed companies like airlines, cruise industry, and hotels. So it has been a large response. Of course, that is money that we don't have in a rainy day fund. We're putting that on the credit card. And so that's debt that we're accruing. But the analogy has been made that when your roof is falling in, you have to fix your roof, and you have to do whatever it takes to do that. And so we are doing that. We're going to head back on Friday. We'll have another package we'll look at to review on how we respond. I've said I think the best stimulus to getting the economy going is obviously to open back up in a smart way, relying on the health professionals. I think Dr. Fauci's plan of a 14-day phased-in plan is what we ought to be looking at. Unfortunately, in downstate Illinois, we haven't had that. There's been some frustration with our governor here, but we will continue to respond accordingly. And obviously, this just isn't a U.S. problem. It's a problem around the world. 184 countries have been affected. And lastly, I would just say there is going to be a renewed emphasis on holding China accountable for the misinformation, the deceitfulness, the complicit nature of what they engaged in and what happened with the World Health Organization. And I think you'll see the Congress react accordingly as it relates to our supply chain in China and holding them accountable moving forward. So I think we're up to 320 bills or resolutions that have been introduced in the Congress that go after China on this. So I look forward to working on those issues with a number of my colleagues. So that's been the response. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to get a vaccine, to get a treatment, to get a cure. And I know the president and the coronavirus task force are working on that with the private sector. I have no doubt we'll get there. And lastly, I would just say we are a resilient and a resourceful and a faithful country. And we are going to get through this. I'd never bet against America. We are going to be there for the world. We're going to be there for our own country, and we will get through this, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. So shifting now into our topic of focus, which is really the developing situation in Lebanon. We've seen, I think Tony laid out nicely, we're seeing really new concerns that we had hoped we wouldn't get to, but there was a lot of hopefulness around the protests last fall. But what we've seen develop is a huge financial crisis. We've got out of control inflation. Right now, we've seen banks closed and people unable to access their capital. Unemployment potentially at 50%. Do you think Congress, the U.S. Congress, has a role to play here in potentially alleviating or holding accountable? And if so, what could that role be?
Well, Peter, thanks for the question. And just a little background. Obviously, I'm proud of my own Lebanese heritage. I'm proud in the district that I represent. I represent over 8,000 Lebanese Christian families. Proud to be a member of St. Charbel Parish in Peoria, Illinois. And so, I think about my own family and my own heritage when I think about Lebanon. And obviously honored to be the co-chair of the U.S. Lebanese Friendship Caucus in the House of Representatives. We are now up to 26 members of Congress that we have as part of the working group with the Friendship Caucus, Republicans and Democrats, that are very much aligned on working for the benefit of Lebanon. I will also say, Peter, I had the opportunity at the end of September of 19, beginning of October, to be in Lebanon. I went there with the American Task Force for Lebanon, and I brought two other members of Congress. I brought Garrett Graves, a Republican from Louisiana, who is a Lebanese American, and also Donna Shalala from Miami, Florida, who's Lebanese American also. She's a Democrat. And so we went there. And that was right at the kind of the start of the economic crisis and the protests in Lebanon. And as we try to do when we're in Lebanon, we visited with all the government officials there. We went to a refugee camp and went through a lot of the issues. But so I just give that as background. But fast forward to today, Peter, in your question, and there is no doubt it has gotten a lot worse in terms of the economic crisis in Lebanon. It is at a critical juncture, and Lebanon really is at the crossroads in terms of the economic crisis they're faced with. You saw that they weren't able to make their payments on their Euro bonds. Now the IMF has come in. In some ways, I mean, you can look at this two ways. You never want to have the IMF or the World Bank come in to bail you out or to dictate how you're going to run your country. But that's unfortunately where we're at now. And it appears that the Lebanese government, the new government that has been formed, is working with the IMF now. And that's kind of the last resort, is having the IMF come in to help prop up the Lebanese economy. They need money. They need liquidity in their government to get them going. And obviously, you've seen there's been a run on dollars there. There's been a lot of issues with the banking system there. Most people on this call know this, but the two foundational things that have been solid and been looked at by the international community as really reliable entities, pillars really in Lebanon, have been the banking system and the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces. And I think what you've seen now is the banking system has been eroding, and that pillar is suffering. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but this economic crisis. And we can talk about the reasons for that, Peter. It relates to corruption. It relates to, obviously, the role Hezbollah has played in the government and what they've done to be destructive in some ways to the economy there. And then just the lack of a government for so long of a period of time, and not privatizing. That's one thing that we focused on when we were in Lebanon, was how do we get the private sector to come in and take, for instance, the communication system or the garbage system or the how the ports are run or the airport is run, and to make that a system that's not controlled by a few people, but to turn that over to the private sector. That's really what needs to happen. And so there is a roadmap and a model to have that done. But again, I would go back to this statement. Lebanon needs to help itself. There is no doubt this is a crisis, but it's also a crisis of opportunity. The Lebanese people, which have risen up, and the good thing about the protests is they have been multifaceted in terms of who's been in those protests. It's been a representative group of Lebanon. That's a positive thing. For the most part, they've been nonviolent. That's a good thing. But they've gotten the attention. I mean, Lebanon is a resilient country. It's gotten through so much. The last thing that it wants to do is go back to conflict. But working through the smart, bright people that are in Lebanon to reach some of these goals as it relates to the economy has to happen. But they have to do it themselves. That's the bottom line. The Americans are going to be there where we need to be. The international community is going to be there to be. But if they can't make the tough decisions and the tough reforms and the anti-corruption, put in place the anti-corruption measures that they need to do, they're not going to find a lot of support in the international community.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to pitch you back over to Tonya to ask a question.
Right. Well, Congressman, you mentioned the LAF, and it's one of the pillars, but with the ever-increasing tension between Hezbollah and Israel, what is the role of the LAF in Lebanon, and should the U.S. continue to be such a close strategic partner? We've recently heard calls from some of your colleagues in Congress to remove U.S. support for the LAF. So if we can hear your thoughts on that.
Well, my view on the LAF, and we spent a lot of time with, of course, General Joseph Aoun, the commander of the Lebanese Armed Forces. We were with him when we were there last year. I have immense respect for him. I think he is somebody that is independent and has the authority needed to run the LAF. As you mentioned, for a long time, the LAF has been reliable and stable and really the non-corrupt entity in Lebanon. Part of that is, I mean, the U.S. has helped support the LAF along with other countries. We've given them well over $1 billion in the last 10 years in terms of equipment and manpower and support to the troops. And so they have been the glue or the stability to keep them together. But I think we are, the U.S. government, our military are constantly watching and observing to make sure that Hezbollah is not infiltrating the Lebanese armed forces. I think that would be a mistake on so many different levels. And I have no doubt that they continue to try to infiltrate the LAF. But we have to make sure, and every time that I have the opportunity to talk to Commander Aoun, I tell him, you have to maintain that independence. The world is watching, the United States is watching, and it's so important for Lebanon moving forward. And so I would just tell you this, in my own observations, in my contacts with our own military and our intelligence services, I also keep in close touch with the National Security Council at the White House, that they remain confident with the LAF. It doesn't mean they aren't watching them and observing them for anything that's out of the normal there. So it's something to watch. And you're right, there are some members of Congress and others that maybe don't fully understand Lebanon, that think, well, Lebanon can just go the way of Syria, which is like a terrible judgment to make. But there are people out there that don't understand the complex nature of what Lebanon has gone through over the last 30 years and how the government they have is created, and the good people that are there that care deeply about Lebanon and the future and democracy. And so there's a educational process, and I know IDC knows that, and I know the American Task Force for Lebanon knows that, and many others, but you constantly got to educate. And that's part of what the U.S. Lebanese Friendship Caucus is, talking to our colleagues about that relationship, the history, and what the LAF means. And this is a struggle, but it's a struggle worth having to keep Lebanon that independent, prosperous country that it can be in the future. But that is a tough thing sometimes to manage. And lastly, the only other point that I would make is, I think we have a real ally for the LAF and in general Lebanon in Secretary Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo understands Lebanon very well. When he was a member of Congress, had a Lebanese population in his district that he was close with. Same with his wife. When he was our CIA director, he spent quite a bit of time in Lebanon. So he understands the politics and the dynamics there very, very well, and the importance of the LAF. So he has been a real ally in this effort, particularly in the administration, where there are others that don't have that same thought process when it comes to the country of Lebanon. And so we got to continue to rely on him as an ally.
Agreed, 100%.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm gonna ask. I've got one more question for you, but I just want to let our audience know again. We've got some questions coming in. We're going to get to those next. If you do have questions, go on ahead and put those in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to those just in one moment. Congressman, one last question from me. We've seen from the Trump administration a unequivocal commitment to a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, holding Iran accountable within the region. We've seen, really that's a lot of that has occurred, or the hottest moments of that have occurred in Iraq recently over the last few months. But as we see what appears to pretty clearly to be increasing Iranian involvement, trying to control the situation in Lebanon, do you think there is a space or an opportunity, or would it be helpful for the administration to look at Lebanon as one of those fronts where Iran's sort of expansionist ideas need to be pushed back on?
Well, Peter, I think it's a great question. And there are several members of the Trump administration that understand that dynamic, and there are others that don't. But let's back up a little bit. Obviously, the prior administration had talked about the influence of Iran in supporting Lebanon. But I'm going to tell you this. I give President Trump a lot of credit for taking out Suleimani. It was controversial at the time, but it was the right decision, really, to take a terrorist off the battlefield. And it was, again, decisive. It was the right decision to take. And by the way, I know this went reported, but 2 days before he got killed, where was he at? He was in Beirut meeting with Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they obviously had a close working relationship. But that sent a message that this type of behavior of going from country to country, engaged in terrorist activity, supporting Hezbollah and these different militias was going to stop. And so and when you think about the protection of Christians and what Hezbollah has done and can continue to do in terms of their effort against Christians, it was the right thing to do. Secondarily, I would just mention this, and this is obviously a separate issue, but taking out al-Baghdadi. Obviously, he was a Sunni, but what he had done, as Tonya had mentioned earlier, in terms of his effort to go after Christians in a barbaric way. Again, President Trump deserves a lot of credit for taking him off the battlefield and sending in that mission to kill him in Syria. And so those are two monumental things that we tend to forget about because of the news of the day. But that's an administration that took decisive action that in the long run is going to help Christians. But on Iran in particular, listen, they are going through a terrible financial crisis also, and were hit extraordinarily hard by the coronavirus. But we're going to continue through sanctions. Obviously, the sanctions have had an effect. The economy of Iran is in shambles, and you know, they've continued to try to reach out for a lifeline, and we've kept that pressure on. So that's a good thing. The money that used to flow into those militias, particularly in Iraq and Syria and into southern Lebanon, that money has slowed down, which is a positive thing for Lebanon. And that pressure is important. You know, people talk about cutting off the head of the snake. The head of the snake is Iran. And if you do that, you know, the influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and particularly southern Lebanon, is going to be weak. And we always have to remember that. And so, again, it's a complicated situation in a very dangerous neighborhood, meaning Lebanon, and the intricacies there. But again, having people that understand that and the importance of supporting the LAF and going after Iran to weaken Hezbollah is very, very important. And so we got to continue to advocate in that direction.
Wonderful. Well, we're now going to shift our focus over to questions from our listeners. And the first one is from Chad. And Chad asks, what legislative initiatives has the Lebanese caucus, or the Lebanese Friendship Caucus, I assume, been engaged in that address the U.S.-Lebanese policy, particularly addressing the refugee crisis? I think he's probably referring here to Syrian refugee crisis and how that's impacted Lebanon.
Yeah. So great question and a timely question. As I mentioned, my last trip to Lebanon, we did go visit a number of Syrian refugees right on the outskirts of Beirut. The last time that I was in Lebanon about 2 years ago, I did the same thing down in Tyre and Sidon to firsthand see those. We also, as we routinely do, met with the UN while we were there, the High Commissioner on Refugees. So to the specific question, one of the first bills I introduced when I got to Congress was a bill to set up or work with the UN in New York to set up zones in Syria within the boundaries of Syria to bring the refugees back, similar to what's been done in Jordan with the refugees there. And to do that, again, it's not as easy as it would seem, but our legislation would work with the UN to do that. We've had some fruitful discussions on that legislation, but as of yet, we haven't been able to work through the really cumbersome bureaucratic rules that the UN have for refugees, right? You can't just ship them back. But what we wanted to do is create safe zones within the borders of Syria on the other side of the Lebanese border to do that. And we continue to work on that legislation, again, working with the Commission on Refugees at the UN, working with Syria on that. Of course, Syria has to have a say in that. They have to agree to that, and they have not agreed to do that. Again, they got their hand out and want other things in return for that. But there is no doubt with the war in Syria dying down, now is the time to think about how we move these refugees back to Syria. It has to happen. And the longer they stay, you know, the more embedded they become in Lebanese society. And so that is, again, a piece of legislation that we'll continue to work on trying to get them back. But again, even if we pass that bill, there's still, the UN has authority to do what they want, and they have to get approval from the Syrian government.
Complex issue for sure, and one that has to be worked on. Going on to Najid's question, he asked about why is it so hard for our current and really for past administrations to put pressure on Israel when it comes to them often violating Lebanese airspace. And he's asking this in relation to the fact that it's used by Hezbollah to rally support for them to remain armed, saying, it's a talking point for them to use regularly. Is there some way the U.S. relationship with Israel can be used to try and remove that as a talking point?
Well, obviously, Israel is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, ally of America in the Middle East. The relationship is really inseparable there. But you got to remember, obviously, there are infractions that go on both sides. But Hezbollah continues to bait them and engage them, and flex their muscle towards Israel, and that gets a response, right? And sometimes that helps Hezbollah. They want a response, right? It makes them look tough or makes them look better. And so there's a kind of almost a Cold War mentality that goes on between the two. But Hezbollah uses it to their advantage in some ways. And obviously, southern Lebanon is a complicated area in what goes on there. And sometimes the people in southern Lebanon, they find affinity with Hezbollah because they look at them as their protectorate there. But I would just say this: Hezbollah continues, I think, to use action against Israel that causes a reaction, that reaction, whether it's flying drones or whether it's coming over in their airspace or whether that's not abiding by the border in Shaba Farms and other areas, I don't think is going away anytime soon. Has the U.S. tried to engage Israel on those issues? Of course, we've worked with them extensively particularly on the demarcation of the border going out into the ocean. There has been, former Undersecretary Feldman has been very engaged on fixing the border and going almost segment by segment and getting that done. He's worked extensively with the Israelis on it. So that's something you don't necessarily hear about. But once we get that border demarcated and we get that official, going way out into the ocean, so then Lebanon could potentially explore gas and other reserves out in the ocean, that will be important. That work is going on as we speak. And the U.S. is using that relationship with Israel to try to get that done and hopefully have a safe and secure border between the two countries.
All right, next question comes from Angela, and she's shifting our focus a little bit, but I think it's a helpful question. She says, my question is about Christian groups, especially in northern Iraq. It's an area where they've received U.S. aid funds in the last couple of years. All religious minorities and ethnic groups that have been targeted there have been receiving aid. And it's for a number of variety of projects, obviously. And I think her question, which she's asked at the end here is, will that funding continue to be renewed? Do you think that funding is going to continue to be supplied to those communities over the next couple of years? I know that a lot of those projects are long-term. They're not when you have an area like Mosul and like the Nineveh Plain that was just destroyed by the war with ISIS. It's a long-term rebuilding project. I think, is there expectation that there will be an ongoing commitment from Congress?
Well, thank you for the question on that. A couple things come to mind on this. Remember, I give the Trump administration a lot of credit. They came in, they focused on ISIS. They have destroyed ISIS. We don't even think about ISIS anymore. And so they used a concerted effort to destroy ISIS in Iraq and in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. And they deserve a lot of credit because of again, what ISIS had done to Christians and just brutally trying to exterminate them in Iraq. That's the first thing. Second thing, again, this administration deserves a lot of credit, putting former governor and former U.S. Senator Brownback in charge of religious freedom. And that was an office that had never been created before. This administration put a priority on the protection of religious minorities and particularly Christians around the world. Money has flown to that office and continues to do that. Vice President Pence has been very involved with this. Again, this is really unprecedented from administrations in the past. So that money that you talked about that has been spent and has flowed to those groups wouldn't have happened, in my view, but for Vice President Pence and Ambassador Brownback now working on those issues. So when she asked, will that money continue to be there? Listen, I think if this administration remains in place for another 4 years, absolutely. That will be a priority. It needs to be a priority when we think about, the loss of Christians in the Middle East and the hemorrhaging of people, particularly Christians, leaving the Middle East. So those are three things that I think have been impactful: eliminating ISIS, putting Brown back in charge, and the vice president helping to allocate money there.
Yeah, absolutely. All huge points. Next question comes from Tony, and interesting question. I think a helpful question. He asks, is there a way for the international community, the U.S. and the UN, to create a mechanism that could potentially put pressure on or even have trials of some of the officials within Lebanon who have used their power to rob the people, essentially, monetarily, of resources, embezzling funds, sort of the list goes on, bribery. There's a long list, and we've seen the Lebanese people protesting in frustration over these actions. Is there a way for the international community to step in and apply pressure for reform there?
Well, there are clearly institutions internationally, and Tony referenced the number of them, whether it's the UN or the International Court on International Criminal Court, the IMF, the World Bank. I mean, but I'm going to go back to think about the assassination of Hariri and what happened. There was a UN group that came in. They pinpointed exactly who they believed did the murder. They tried to bring them to justice and could never do that, right? And again, frustrating on so many different levels that somebody as important as a leader like him gets murdered. They have an investigation, but you can't bring them to justice. The answer is yes. We need to bring those corrupt officials that continue to rip off the Lebanese people and the taxpayers there, and bring them to justice, and using them as an example. When I think, I'm a former prosecutor, I spent 10 years as a state and a federal prosecutor. And under our system, it sends a deterrent message. When you prosecute someone, that deters that type of behavior, hopefully. But we haven't had enough of that in Lebanon. There aren't examples of that. And again, that gets to an independent judiciary, but also international organizations that can come in and hold people accountable for, again, ripping off. And there are many examples, as I mentioned earlier, of corrupt activities within Lebanon that need to be fixed. That has not been done. But listen, I'm supportive of that. I'm open to ideas on that, on how we can get international pressure and groups to hold people accountable. I think it would help to change the landscape in Lebanon and have a system based on laws and fairness and people being held accountable.
Thank you. That's great. We're going to take time for a couple more questions here. We have one from Scott, and he asks, he talks about Turkey and their role in the region. He says Turkey has been expanding its influence in both Syria and Libya recently. Do they have any partners in Lebanon that could allow for a similar path? So I think what he's referring to is, Turkish attempts to expand and extend their reach and control. And do you see them trying to do so in Lebanon? And if so, is there any particular party there or group there that you think would be likely to ally with Turkey?
Interesting question. Obviously, Turkey has made some moves with the Syrian civil war going on, related to the Kurds, related to what's happening in northwest in Idlib province in northwest Syria, and the confrontation they had with the Syrian government there. So they have clearly engaged. And then obviously the coup attempt that was that almost occurred with Erdogan, several years ago. So there's a lot going on. But to the specifics of that question, Peter, I am not aware of any influence that they have tried to exert in Lebanon with any of the political parties there. Doesn't mean they haven't. But when I think about obviously the players that have tried to be involved in Lebanon, obviously Russia continues to try to play an outside role, along with Iran, as we know, and of course the United States. Those would be the three that come to mind as it relates to Lebanon. But I'm not aware that Turkey has exercised any influence or has attempted to do that in Lebanon.
I'm going to ask a question here from Hassam. He asks, are there talks with the LAF and the IDF regarding working together to rid the country of Hezbollah? And let me nuance that a little bit even and add, we obviously have UNIFIL in there as well, and I don't know if you had got a chance to meet with them when you were in Lebanon. Is there a role that they play in this mix? Are there conversations between the LAF and the IDF and UNIFIL, and how does that look?
Yeah, when we were there last fall, we did meet with UNIFIL and had a good conversation. Talked extensively about their work along the border and what they're engaged in, and actually saw a lot of video and other things, evidentiary information about what was going on along the border there. And listen, they play an integral role. I think they have thousands of troops along the border there from different countries, and play a unique role that we need them there. And I think they, more than anyone else, knows what goes on the border between Israel and Lebanon. They've obviously given recommendations on what to do, but in some ways they don't have the ability. They are the intermediaries, right? They're kind of the Switzerland of the conflict, right? But I think it's important. They I think supply useful information. They are good arbiters of the truth. I think they are objective in terms of what goes on at the border and how that information can be used in negotiations to resolve some of those issues along the border. But I am personally, I'm thankful that they're there. I hope there's a time and place where the LAF can come in and replace them. And Lebanon is as strong and as forceful and as robust to have their own presence along there. And there's no need for the UN along there. But we're not there yet, clearly.
Question. This is from an anonymous viewer, but they ask. So you mentioned Mr. Jeffrey Feltman. And they refer to a recent article Mr. Feltman wrote where he actually proposed the potential of using sanctions against former Foreign Minister Gibran Bassil, and he wondering, our questioner's wondering, is that a proposal that you think would have merit and you would potentially get behind?
Well, I don't know enough about that. I know the former Minister of Foreign Affairs is out of the government now, so I'm not sure if he wrote that when he was in the government, but he's not part of the new government. But clearly, when there are actions that are taken that are inappropriate or violate the law, we need to hold people accountable on that. So again, as a former prosecutor, I'd want to see the facts and evidence that relate to that before I make a judgment on that. But there is no doubt, I will tell you this, if there is facts and evidence of people engaged in wrongdoing, they need to be held accountable and send a message, whether that's in Lebanon or the United States or anywhere.
And I'm going to grab from another comment that we had come in, and tags sort of in addition to that question, piggyback. We've heard conversations recently about the possibility of using Golub-Magnitsky Act sanctions that are for human rights violators. So under that umbrella of the Golub-Magnitsky Act is corruption. Do you think Congress would consider encouraging those? The State Department, Treasury, I know all the different sort of branches of government get involved with that. But is that something you think should be considered?
Listen, I think everything should be on the table. How do we get the attention of bad actors in Lebanon? And listen, I give the Treasury Department a lot of credit for going after individuals related to Hezbollah and money laundering and corrupt activities. They've done that over the last couple years. And I know Undersecretary Schenker's been involved with that and sent a strong message. I think where it can be used in kind of a precision way to send a message that type of behavior is not going to be tolerated, everything needs to be on the table. When we look at how do we change behavior and deter bad actors from continuing to engage in the activities that they have in Lebanon to disrupt the government and to look out for their own interests or the interests of Hezbollah and others.
Well, Congressman, I'm going to ask one final question here. I know we're going to try and wrap up our time, so I know everyone has busy days. I want to thank everyone for taking the time out, and especially you, Congressman, for taking the time out to be with us. But just as a final question, I wanted to ask you about the Middle Eastern Christian diaspora in your community. You're obviously part of it, and just maybe share a little bit about the importance of the diaspora here in the United States. They're from Detroit to LA, all over the country, and especially there in Peoria.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I'm obviously very fond of my own heritage. I tell people all the time, we're proud to have 8,000 Lebanese families here in Peoria, Illinois, that are thriving and doing well and are successful in so many different areas. And almost all of them go back to the small village in northern Lebanon where my great-grandparents came from. Sam LaHood and Sarah Unis. They came off that mountain, got on a ship, came through Ellis Island, and they got on a train. And the last stop on the train was Peoria, Illinois. And you know, everybody else has a similar story, whether it's 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 25 years ago, or last year, on people coming from Lebanon. But we are obviously proud of our heritage of working hard, playing by the rules, putting an emphasis on family and education, and that continues in this country. And obviously Lebanese all over this country that play integral roles in America, right? In their business, in their profession, in their families, in their church, integral part of that. But what I always try to say is don't forget where you came from. And for us, it's not forgetting where we came from in Lebanon, and standing up for the people that are there, and for the right reasons, and how to play a role, whether it's financially or through politics, to influence what goes on in Lebanon for the better. And that's what we try to do through our strong Lebanese relationship here in Peoria.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I want to kick it back to Tony to have the last word, but just before I do, I want to encourage everyone. We are we've had these great, wonderful call here, and we're doing these regularly with different members of Congress and different experts. We also do weekly member calls for the members of IDC, the organization, so you can find those on our social media. We encourage you to check those out. We have one coming up this Friday, but Tony, I'll give it to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to say thank you, Congressman, for being with us today. Thank you for your voice in Congress. It is so important, not only for the United States, but for the Middle Eastern Christians. We need you there. We are grateful you are there for advocating on behalf of us. And just thank you again for taking the time to be with us today and answer our questions. Thank you.
Well, Tonya and Peter, thanks again. And for the entire membership of IDC, look forward to continuing to work with you as partners as we tackle these important issues in the Middle East on behalf of Christians, on behalf of Lebanon. And so, again, thank you. And I want to wish everybody to be safe and healthy moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Have a good day.
Thank
All right, you
you
too. Take care. Thanks.